In 1885, Wyoming Territory, desperate cowboy Jake Harlow faces total ruin. With foreclosure looming, he reluctantly marries Eleanor Montgomery, a wealthy 71-year-old cattle baroness. The townspeople mock him as a fortune hunter while her greedy nephews plot against him. But 7 days after their wedding, Jake discovers a shocking secret that will change everything. Before we start the video, comment where you are tuning in from. Jake Harlow stared at the foreclosure notice, the paper trembling slightly in his calloused hands. 3 seasons of merciless drought had reduced his once promising homestead to dust and desperation. His remaining horses, once the pride of his small ranch, stood listlessly in their corral, ribs visible beneath dull coats. 30 days, the bank manager had said with practiced indifference. Not a day more, Harlow. That evening at the Rusty Nail Saloon, Jake nursed a whiskey he couldn't afford when his friend Tom Sullivan slid onto the neighboring stool. "Heard about the Montgomery situation?" Tom asked, signaling for a drink. Jake grunted noncommittally. Everyone in Cottonwood Springs knew about the Montgomery Ranch. 20,000 acres of the best grazing land in the territory, managed by the reclusive widow Eleanor Montgomery. "Word is she's looking for a husband," Tom continued. "Someone to run the operation and inherit the whole empire," Jake laughed bitterly. "What would a wealthy cattle baroness want with a failing rancher? She's 71, Jake, and not looking for romance." Tom leaned closer. "She needs an heir and a capable manager. You're the best horseman in 3 counties." "I'm not that desperate," Jake muttered, although the lie felt hollow against the weight of the foreclosure notice in his pocket. 2 days later, with his options dwindling faster than his water supply, Jake found himself at a town meeting where Eleanor Montgomery made a rare appearance. She sat at the front, heavily veiled, ramrod straight despite her apparent age. When she spoke about water rights, her voice carried surprising authority. Jake couldn't help but notice how the nephews flanking her, Richard and Clarence Montgomery, watched everyone with suspicious, calculating eyes. The following morning, Jake swallowed his pride and rode to the Montgomery Ranch. The sprawling main house made his cabin look like a child's playhouse. Richard Montgomery greeted him with undisguised contempt. "Another fortune hunter," he sneered, leading Jake to a formal sitting room. "You're the third this month." Eleanor Montgomery entered slowly, leaning on an ornate cane. Up close, Jake could see little of her face behind the heavy veil, but he noted her hands, gnarled with age but steady as she gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Harlow," she said, her voice crisp despite its aged timbre. "I understand you're an excellent horseman fallen on hard times." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, ma'am, I'll be direct. I need a husband who can manage this ranch and carry the Montgomery legacy forward. In return, he'll inherit everything eventually." He tapped her cane lightly. "I've outlived 3 husbands, Mr. Harlow. I'm not easily impressed." For the next hour, Eleanor questioned Jake about ranching methods, horse breeding, and water management. Her knowledge was impressive, her questions incisive. "My terms are non-negotiable," she finally stated. "Marriage on paper, you'll manage operations under my guidance. Within 2 years, we adopt an heir. You inherit fully 7 years after our marriage, provided the ranch prospers." "And if I refuse?" Jake asked quietly. Eleanor's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Then Richard and Clarence inherit and you lose your homestead next month. Consider carefully, Mr. Harlow." Jake rode back to his dying ranch as sunset painted the drought-stricken land in deceptive gold. His choices had narrowed to one: swallow his pride or lose everything. 3 days later, Jake Harlow and Eleanor Montgomery were married in a brief ceremony witnessed only by the ranch foreman, the nephews, and the local judge. As they signed the marriage certificate, Jake caught a glimpse of Richard's face, a mask of barely contained fury. Clarence simply looked calculating, like a man tallying losses. Jake moved into the east wing of the mansion that same day, understanding all too well the whispers that would follow him in town: fortune hunter, old woman's fool, desperate cowboy. His new wife retired to her quarters, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and the weight of his decision. A week into the marriage, Jake began noticing peculiarities about his elderly bride. Eleanor never joined him for meals, citing digestive difficulties. She held meetings with the ranch hands alone, and sometimes Jake would catch snippets of conversation that sounded oddly youthful from a woman of 71. The ranch itself was impressive but showed signs of neglect that contradicted Eleanor's reputation for meticulous management. Several pastures lay unused, and the northern section of the property remained mysteriously off-limits, even to senior hands. The nephews made Jake's transition difficult. Richard openly undermined Jake's authority with the ranch hands while Clarence reviewed every decision with suspicious scrutiny. "Aunt Eleanor has buried 3 husbands," Richard warned Jake one evening, Bourbon loosening his tongue. "Don't get too comfortable." Jake's unease grew when he discovered discrepancies in the ranch's financial records. The Montgomery ranch should have been thriving, yet cash reserves were unusually low. When Jake attempted to discuss this with Eleanor, she abruptly ended their meeting, claiming fatigue. On the 7th night after their wedding, Jake was reviewing cattle logs in his study when he heard a crash from Eleanor's private study down the hall. He rushed to her door, finding it locked. "Eleanor, are you all right?" No response came except a muffled groan. Concerned, Jake shouldered through the door to find Eleanor collapsed near her desk. As he hurried to help her, he froze in astonishment. Before his eyes, Eleanor Montgomery began to transform. The gray wig had shifted, revealing auburn hair beneath. As she struggled to right herself, patches of aged skin, prosthetics, Jake realized with shock, pulled away from a much younger face. The hunched posture straightened as she finally looked up at him with clear green eyes that held no hint of elderly frailty. "Well," she said in a voice utterly different from Eleanor's raspy tone, "this isn't how I planned to tell you." Jake stepped back, hand instinctively moving to where his gun would normally be. "Who are you?" the woman sighed, removing more of the facial prosthetics. "Charlotte Montgomery, William Montgomery's daughter." She gestured to a chair. "You might want to sit down. This is rather a long story." Over the next hour, Charlotte explained how her father's suspicious death 3 years earlier had left her vulnerable. Believing his fall from a cliff was actually murder, she'd created the Eleanor persona, her fictional aunt, to protect herself while investigating. "The nephews, my cousins, actually have been systematically draining the ranch's resources," Charlotte explained. "I needed someone trustworthy to help me expose them, but I couldn't risk revealing myself until I was certain of your character." "So you married me under false pretenses," Jake said flatly. "Yes." Charlotte didn't flinch from his accusation. "And you married an old woman for her money. Neither of us approached this with complete honesty." Jake couldn't argue with that. "Why reveal yourself now?" "Because someone just tried to kill me," Charlotte said grimly, pointing to a bullet hole in the wall behind her desk. "And because I've seen enough to know you're the partner I need." Jake's anger at Charlotte's deception warred with his reluctant admiration for her audacity. The scheme was elaborate, clever, and born of legitimate fear, qualities he could respect, even if he resented being manipulated. "You could have just hired me as a foreman," he pointed out the next morning as they rode the property's perimeter, Charlotte now dressed as herself for the first time in his presence. "A foreman can be fired," she replied. "I needed someone with legal standing to protect the ranch if something happened to me." They agreed to maintain the charade publicly while investigating the financial discrepancies and her father's death. Charlotte would continue appearing as Eleanor when necessary, while Jake would take a more active role in managing the ranch, now with Charlotte's covert guidance. Jake soon discovered Charlotte was a brilliant rancher in her own right. Her knowledge of breeding lines and grazing rotations surpassed even his, and her business instincts were razor-sharp. For her part, Charlotte watched Jake's gentle handling of nervous colts and fair treatment of the ranch hands with growing respect. But their partnership faced immediate challenges. The accidents began small, a broken fence allowing prize bulls to escape, feed mysteriously spoiled. Then came the fire in the western barn, followed by Jake's ambush in town by 2 strangers who left him with bruised ribs and a warning to stop asking questions. "They're getting desperate," Charlotte said as she bandaged Jake's injuries. "We must be getting close to something." That something revealed itself when Charlotte showed Jake her father's private journal. William Montgomery had discovered a major silver deposit in the ranch's restricted northern territory shortly before his death. "He only told me," Charlotte explained. "We were going to announce it after finalizing the legal paperwork." She pointed to a map. "The claim was never registered because he died first." Jake whistled low. "That's motive for murder, and explains the partnerships I found between Richard, Clarence, and Summit Mining Company." Charlotte's eyes hardened. "They killed my father for that silver." Their investigation was compromised when Richard nearly caught Charlotte without her Eleanor disguise. The nephew's subsequent behavior became increasingly erratic and threatening. "They're watching us too closely," Jake said after another near discovery. "We need to force their hand," Charlotte agreed. "It's time for Alina Montgomery to make an announcement about the northern property." As they planned their trap, Jake realized his feelings for Charlotte had evolved from grudging respect to something deeper. Her courage, intelligence, and quiet vulnerability when speaking of her father touched something in him. He'd thought the drought had killed hope. For her part, Charlotte found herself watching Jake when he wasn't looking, nodding the way he gentled horses with whispered words, how he remembered every ranch hand's family troubles, his unexpected humor in tense moments. This marriage of convenience had grown complicated in ways neither had anticipated. The announcement was set for the monthly ranch gathering when all hands would be present. Charlotte, again disguised as a leaner, would reveal plans to survey the Northern Territory for development, effectively baiting the trap. Jake positioned trusted hands strategically throughout the main house, while Charlotte arranged for the sheriff to arrive, coincidentally, midway through the gathering. What they hadn't anticipated was Clarence overhearing their preparations. The gathering began with customary reports and announcements. Alina sat regally at the head of the long table, Jake standing supportively beside her. Richard and Clarence arrived late, accompanied by a well-dressed stranger Charlotte identified as James Harrington, Summit Mining's representative. "Before we conclude," Alina announced, "I've decided to develop the northern section of the property. Mr. Harlow will oversee the project, beginning with a comprehensive survey next week." The reaction was immediate. Richard's face flushed deep red while Clarence exchanged meaningful glances with Harrington. "Aunt Alina," Richard protested, "that land is unstable. Father always said." "William knew exactly what that land contained," Alina interrupted. "As did you, apparently." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Harrington moved toward the door while Richard stood abruptly. "You've become quite forgetful lately, Aunt. Perhaps it's time to discuss your competency to manage this ranch." What happened next unfolded with frightening speed. Clarence drew a concealed pistol, aiming not at Alina but at Jake. "This has gone far enough." Before he could fire, the ranch foreman tackled him from behind. Harrington pulled his own weapon as Richard lunged for Alina. In the chaos, Charlotte's disguise began to slip. "What the devil?" Richard froze as he grabbed his aunt's arm, feeling the padding beneath her sleeve. Charlotte knew the moment had come. She straightened to her full height, pulled away the facial prosthetics, and removed the wig in one smooth motion. "Hello, cousin," she said coldly. "Surprised to see me?" The shock that rippled through the room was palpable. The ranch hands who weren't part of the plan stared in disbelief. Richard's face transformed from confusion to rage to calculation in seconds. "Charlotte," he sputtered. "You've been alive, investigating how you murdered my father for the silver deposit." She nodded toward Harrington. "With his company's backing, I assume." Harrington made a break for the door but found the sheriff blocking his path, summoned by one of Jake's men as planned. What followed was a testament to how thoroughly Charlotte and Jake had prepared. Evidence was presented. The partnership agreements Jake had discovered, William Montgomery's journal documenting the silver find, financial records showing embezzlement. Most damning was Clarence's subsequent confession, turning on Richard and Harrington in exchange for leniency. The aftermath transformed Cottonwood Springs. The nephews and Harrington faced justice for William Montgomery's murder. The town that had whispered about Jake's fortune hunting now regarded both him and Charlotte with a complex mixture of respect and wary admiration. "What happens now?" Jake asked Charlotte a week later as they stood on the main house's porch, watching the sun set over land that had begun to recover with the arrival of autumn rains. "Legally, we're still married," Charlotte replied, "though under false pretenses." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Not the most honest beginning." "No," Charlotte turned to face him directly. "I propose we start over, dissolve this marriage, and decide what we truly want." To her surprise, Jake laughed. "Charlotte Montgomery, you are without doubt the most challenging, brilliant, frustrating woman I've ever met." His expression softened. "And I find I don't want to dissolve anything. Even though I deceived you, we deceived each other," he corrected. "I married an elderly woman for financial security. You married a desperate rancher for protection. Neither of us was entirely wrong in our assumptions." Charlotte smiled slowly. "And now I'd like to court you properly," Jake said, "if you'll allow it." 1 year later, the Montgomery Ranch held another gathering. This time, Charlotte stood as herself, Jake at her side as they announced the establishment of the William Montgomery Foundation to support struggling homesteaders during drought years. The silver mine operated under the ranch's direct management, its profits funding both the foundation and the ranch's expansion. Jake's former homestead had been incorporated into the property, its small cabin preserved as a reminder of how far they'd come. Not bad for a desperate cowboy and a woman in disguise, Jake murmured as they walked among their guests. Charlotte smiled, her fingers intertwined with his. Sometimes, she replied, the greatest treasures come disguised in unexpected packages. As evening fell, they stood together on the same porch where they'd decided to begin again, watching the sun set over land that was now truly theirs, not through deception or desperation, but through truth hardly won and a partnership forged in the face of danger. The fortune they'd found wasn't in silver or cattle, but in the rarest commodity on the frontier. Someone worth trusting with both your secrets and your heart. In the months that followed the confrontation, Charlotte and Jake worked tirelessly to restore the Montgomery Ranch to its former glory. With the silver mine properly developed and legally registered, the ranch's finances flourished. More importantly, their partnership deepened into a genuine bond of trust and affection. The town's initial skepticism gradually transformed into respect as Jake proved himself a fair and capable rancher. Charlotte, no longer hiding behind the leaner facade, became a respected businesswoman in her own right, often consulting with other ranchers on breeding strategies and water management. At Charlotte's insistence, the couple established a small trust for the children of ranch workers, ensuring education opportunities that had never before existed in Cottonwood Springs. Jake, remembering his own struggles before meeting Charlotte, was particularly passionate about helping smaller ranchers survive the harsh cycles of drought that plagued the territory. My father always said wealth brings responsibility, Charlotte explained to Jake one evening as they reviewed applications for assistance. He would have approved of what we're doing. I wish I could have met him, Jake replied, nodding how Charlotte's eyes still shadowed when she spoke of her father. He would have liked you, she said quietly. Once he got past the fact that you married his daughter for her money, Jake laughed. And that his daughter married me under an elaborate disguise. Their shared laughter echoed through the study that had once been William Montgomery's, now filled with plans and dreams that honored his legacy while creating something entirely new. The legal proceedings against Richard, Clarence, and Harrington concluded with justice that winter. Richard received the harshest sentence, having been proven the mastermind behind William Montgomery's murder. Clarence's testimony, while self-serving, provided the final evidence needed for conviction. Do you feel different now that it's settled? Jake asked Charlotte as they rode back from the courthouse. Charlotte considered the question seriously. I thought I would feel triumphant or at least relieved. Instead, I just feel sad. They were family after all. My father trusted them. Jake understood. The victory was necessary, but hollow justice couldn't bring back what Charlotte had lost. But as they crested the hill overlooking Montgomery Ranch, the sun breaking through winter clouds to illuminate the land stretching before them, he saw her expression light. But this, she said, gesturing toward the ranch, this is worth fighting for, worth building for the future. Spring brought new life to the ranch. Calves dotted the verdant pastures, and the breeding program Jake had instituted began showing promising results. Charlotte's management of the silver mine operations proved so successful that neighboring ranchers sought her advice on similar ventures. Their relationship, too, blossomed with the changing seasons. The business partnership that had begun their marriage evolved into genuine companionship, then deepened into love neither had expected to find. On the anniversary of their unusual wedding, Jake surprised Charlotte with a small velvet box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a simple gold band nestled inside. "I thought," Jake said, suddenly uncertain, "that we might want to exchange real vows this time, as ourselves. If you'd like to, that is." Charlotte's smile was answer enough as she slipped the ring onto her finger. "A proper proposal from my husband, how unconventional of us." Their second wedding was everything the first was not, joyful, honest, and witnessed by the entire community that had come to respect their unusual partnership. The ranch hands and their families celebrated alongside neighboring ranchers and townspeople who had once whispered about the odd marriage between the desperate cowboy and the elderly cattle baroness. As they exchanged vows beneath the ancient cottonwood tree that had given the town its name, Jake thought of how far they'd come from that first reluctant ceremony. "I, Jake Harlow, take you, Charlotte Montgomery, not a leaner," he added with a grin that brought appreciative laughter from those who knew their story, "to be my lawfully wedded wife." Again, Charlotte's response was equally heartfelt. "I, Charlotte Montgomery, take you, Jake Harlow, to be my lawfully wedded husband, without disguises, without reservations, and with complete truth between us." That evening, as they hosted their wedding feast at the ranch, several guests commented on how fitting it was that the Montgomery legacy would continue through such a strong partnership. "Your father would be proud," the elderly judge who had married them both times told Charlotte. "Not just of what you've built, but of who you chose to build it with." Jake, overhearing this, caught Charlotte's eye across the room. Her smile confirmed what he already knew, that some fortunes couldn't be measured in land or silver or cattle, but in the courage to trust another person with your true self. The following 2 years brought unprecedented prosperity to both the Montgomery Ranch and Cottonwood Springs. Under Jake and Charlotte's joint management, the ranch expanded its operations, incorporating innovative breeding techniques Jake had long wanted to try. Charlotte's business acumen turned the silver mine into a model operation, with fair wages and safer conditions than most in the territory. Their personal happiness matched their professional success. While they decided against having children of their own, they informally adopted many of the ranch hands' children as honorary nieces and nephews, establishing educational funds and apprenticeship programs that would shape the next generation of ranchers and businesspeople. Jake's former homestead, once a symbol of his failure and desperation, was transformed into a training facility where struggling ranchers could learn new techniques to survive the harsh Wyoming climate. Charlotte often joked that it had taken a near disaster to bring them together, but perhaps that was fitting for life on the frontier. "We should have a proper celebration," Charlotte suggested one evening as they reviewed the quarterly profits. "5 years of marriage deserves recognition." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Which marriage, the first or the second?" "Both," Charlotte laughed. "Let's invite everyone, make it an annual tradition, the Montgomery Harlow Harvest Festival." The idea took root, and by autumn the ranch was prepared to host the entire community. Tables laden with harvest bounty stretched across the main yard, and music filled the air as townsfolk and ranchers alike gathered to celebrate not just the Montgomery Harlow Union, but the community they had helped build. During the festivities, an unexpected guest arrived. Eleanor Johnson, the elderly woman who had unknowingly provided the inspiration for Charlotte's disguise, arrived on the afternoon stage. Charlotte had been corresponding with her for years, sending generous quarterly payments in thanks for the unwitting role she had played in Charlotte's survival. "So you're the young lady who borrowed my face," Eleanor chuckled when introduced to Charlotte. "Can't say I mind lending it for such a good cause." As evening approached, Jake called for the crowd's attention. Standing beside Charlotte on the main house porch, he raised a glass. "5 years ago, I came to this ranch a desperate man, willing to marry a woman 3 times my age for financial security." This brought appreciative laughter from those who knew the story. "What I found instead was a partner braver and more resourceful than I could have imagined." Charlotte squeezed his hand as he continued. "We built this ranch together just as we're building this community together. The Montgomery Harlow Foundation is pleased to announce we're establishing a permanent school for Cottonwood Springs, with dormitories for ranch children too far to travel daily." Cheers erupted as Charlotte stepped forward to add her own announcement. "Additionally, the foundation will provide low-interest loans to homesteaders struggling with drought or other hardships. No one should lose their dreams for lack of a helping hand at the right moment." As the celebration continued into the night, Jake and Charlotte slipped away to their favorite spot overlooking the ranch. The autumn moon illuminated the vast property, from the silver mine in the north to the grazing land stretching eastward. "Did you ever imagine this outcome when you were creating a leaner?" Jake asked, his arm around Charlotte's shoulders. "Never," she admitted. "I was focused solely on survival and justice for my father." This, she gestured toward the celebration below, "this was beyond imagining." "Speaking of imagination," Jake said, "I've been thinking about those northern parcels, the ones beyond the silver deposit." What about them? The water surveys show potential for irrigation. We could open that land to sharecroppers, help more families establish themselves. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. A new community, we have the resources to support it initially. Montgomery Heights has a nice ring to it, Jake suggested. Harlow Valley sounds better, Charlotte countered with a smile. Their playful debate was interrupted by approaching footsteps. The ranch foreman, Matthews, appeared with an apologetic expression. Sorry to disturb you both, but there's someone here you might want to meet. Says he came all the way from Denver after hearing about your foundation. The visitor proved to be a representative from the territorial governor's office, interested in using the Montgomery Harlow Foundation model as a template for similar programs throughout Wyoming. Your approach to community development is precisely what the territory needs as we push for statehood, he explained. Would you consider serving on a territorial commission? Jake deferred to Charlotte, knowing her mind for policy far exceeded his own. We'd be honored to contribute, she replied, provided we can continue our work here. The commission appointment extended their influence far beyond Cottonwood Springs. Within 3 years, similar foundations operated in 6 counties, and Charlotte's expertise was sought for territorial banking regulations that would protect small ranchers from predatory lending. On a crisp autumn day in their 8th year of marriage, Jake found Charlotte in William Montgomery's study, reviewing old documents. Finding anything interesting? He asked, nodding the faded journal in her hands. My father's earliest plans for the ranch, she replied. It's remarkable how much of what we've built aligns with what he envisioned. Jake studied the plans over her shoulder. He was a forward-thinking man. Yes, Charlotte agreed, but even he couldn't have foreseen this partnership. She looked up at Jake with the same clear-eyed intelligence that had first captured his respect. I started all this to preserve his legacy. Somewhere along the way, it became ours instead. I think he'd approve, Jake said. Legacies are meant to grow, not just endure. That evening, as they hosted the now traditional autumn celebration, Jake watched Charlotte moving confidently among their guests, no disguises, no deceptions, simply herself. He thought of the desperate cowboy he'd been, willing to marry an elderly woman for financial salvation, and marveled at how thoroughly his life had transformed. The fortune he'd sought had materialized, though not in the form he'd expected. The cattle operation prospered, the silver mine produced steady returns, and their influence extended throughout the territory. But watching Charlotte laugh with a leaner Johnson, now a permanent resident of their extended household, Jake knew the true wealth lay elsewhere. It was in the partnership they'd forged from unlikely beginnings, in the community they'd built from the ashes of betrayal. In the future, they continued to shape together, stronger for the challenges they'd overcome. As the celebration wound down, Charlotte found Jake by the old cottonwood tree where they'd exchanged their second honest vows. Penny for your thoughts, Mr. Harlow, she said, slipping her arm through his. Just thinking they were worth more than a cattle empire, Mrs. Harlow Montgomery. What were the 7 days I spent married to an elderly cattle baroness, Jake replied with a smile. They led me to you. Charlotte's laughter, warm and genuine, mingled with the evening breeze as they walked back toward the house they'd made into a home, the center of an ever-expanding circle of influence and opportunity that neither could have achieved alone. What had begun as a desperate bargain between a failing rancher and a woman in disguise had transformed into something neither could have foreseen. A legacy worthy of the Montgomery name and the Harlow determination, built on the most unexpected foundation of all, truth.